You walked away and you thought that would be the end of the story, that silence would swallow your name in their mind and your absence would slowly erase the space you once occupied, but what you didn't realize in that painful, trembling moment when you chose your dignity over desperation is that your departure didn't create peace in them, it created a storm, because when someone has grown accustomed to your energy, your attention, your loyalty, your emotional availability, your constant reassurance, and your willingness to stay even when things felt unfair, your sudden withdrawal doesn't feel like relief to them, it feels like losing control, and control is something the ego never surrenders gracefully. So now while you are rebuilding yourself piece by piece, stitching your confidence back together in quiet nights and reminding yourself why you left in the first place, they are pacing inside their own thoughts, restless, unsettled, replaying conversations, rereading old messages, checking your social media without liking anything, wondering who you are talking to, wondering if you are happier without them, wondering if you are finally seeing your worth in a way they underestimated, and this restlessness is not always loud or dramatic, sometimes it is subtle, it shows up as irritation for no clear reason, as short temper with other people, as boredom in rooms that once felt comfortable, as a strange emptiness during moments that used to feel full when you were there, because what they lost was not just a person but a mirror, a steady presence that made them feel chosen without having to work for it, and when you walked away you removed that mirror and now they are forced to look at themselves without your soft filter, without your patience absorbing their inconsistency, without your forgiveness covering their emotional immaturity. And that discomfort is what keeps them restless at night when the distractions fade and the noise of the day goes quiet. Because the truth is you did not walk away impulsively, you walked away after trying, after explaining, after hoping, after giving chances that slowly chipped away at your own self-respect, and deep down they know that, which is why their mind cannot settle into the narrative that you were dramatic or unreasonable, because your silence now carries more weight than your words ever did. And silence has a way of amplifying everything that was once ignored, so now every time they remember how you used to show up consistently, how you used to support them even when you were tired, how you used to prioritize them even when they barely met you halfway, they feel a tightening in their chest that they cannot easily explain to anyone else, because admitting that they lost someone valuable requires admitting they mishandled something rare, and the ego resists that confession, so instead they oscillate between pride and longing, between telling themselves they don't care and secretly hoping you might reach out first, but you don't, and that is what intensifies the restlessness, because your absence is no longer reactive, it is intentional, it is grounded, it is steady, and there is something profoundly unsettling about realizing that someone you once thought would never leave has actually chosen peace over you, because it forces a confrontation with reality. And reality is rarely gentle when it exposes our complacency, so now they scroll through memories not to feel nostalgia but to measure what they lost. They compare new conversations to the depth they once had with you and find them lacking. They notice how easy it used to be to talk to you and how forced everything else feels. They remember the way you understood their moods without explanation, the way you anticipated their needs without being asked, the way your loyalty made them feel secure even when they offered you uncertainty in return. And this comparison becomes the background noise of their days, a subtle but persistent reminder that what they once took for granted is no longer available on demand, and restlessness grows in the space where certainty once lived, because certainty is comforting and your departure removed that comfort entirely, and perhaps the most unsettling part for them is not even losing you, it is realizing that you are not chasing them, that you are not begging for closure, that you are not trying to prove your worth anymore. Because your calm distance communicates something powerful. It communicates that you finally saw the imbalance and decided you deserved better, and nothing triggers introspection faster than losing access to someone who used to overextend themselves for you. So now they lie awake at night thinking about the last conversation, wondering if they could have said something different, wondering if they pushed too far, wondering if they assumed you would tolerate more than you should have. And even if they never admit it publicly, internally there is a recognition that your walking away was not a loss of love but a loss of tolerance, and that distinction matters, because love can linger even when someone leaves, but tolerance does not return once self-respect has awakened, and that awareness unsettles them deeply, because they can feel the shift in you even from a distance. They can sense that you are no longer emotionally available in the same way, that you are no longer waiting for crumbs of validation, that you are no longer rearranging your boundaries to make them comfortable. And when someone realizes they can no longer access you in the old way, they begin to question their own behavior in ways they previously avoided, and questioning oneself is uncomfortable. It shakes the foundation of identity, it forces accountability, it disrupts the illusion that everything was fine, and so restlessness becomes their silent companion, following them into quiet moments, interrupting their focus, whispering reminders of your absence at the most inconvenient times, because the human mind does not easily release what once felt secure, and you were security even if they did not treat you as such, you were stability even if they acted unpredictable, you were consistency in a dynamic that often lacked balance, and losing that kind of presence creates a void that cannot be immediately filled. And the irony is that when you were there they may have felt confined or bored or too comfortable, but now that you are gone they feel the instability of their own choices, and instability breeds anxiety, and anxiety breeds restlessness, so they check their phone more often than they admit, they wonder if you are seeing someone new, they analyze your online activity, they interpret your silence as strength even if they try to frame it as indifference, and in that interpretation lies the truth they cannot escape, that you walking away shifted the power dynamic completely. Because power in relationships is not about control but about who is willing to walk away, and you proved you were willing, not out of spite but out of self-preservation. And self-preservation is magnetic because it signals growth, it signals boundaries, it signals that you are no longer operating from fear of loss, and when someone senses that they are no longer your emotional center, they feel destabilized, because they had grown used to occupying that space without fully earning it. And now they must sit with the realization that access to you was a privilege, not a guarantee, and privileges once revoked create longing far more intense than things never experienced, so they remember the small details, the inside jokes, the way you looked at them during vulnerable conversations, the comfort of your presence during stressful times, and each memory becomes both comfort and punishment, comfort because it reminds them of warmth, punishment because it reminds them of what they no longer have. And in that duality restlessness thrives, because they cannot fully let go yet cannot fully reach you either, and that in-between space is emotionally exhausting, and while they navigate that exhaustion, you are evolving, you are redirecting your energy inward, you are rediscovering interests you once neglected, you are strengthening friendships, you are building routines that do not revolve around waiting for someone else's attention, and even if they only observe this from afar, they sense it, and your growth without them acts as a mirror to their stagnation. And nothing unsettles someone more than watching the person they underestimated rise without their support, because it challenges the narrative they once told themselves about their importance in your life, and now they must reconcile with the possibility that you were strong all along, that you did not need them as desperately as they assumed, that perhaps they needed you more than they realized. And that reversal of perspective creates cognitive dissonance, and cognitive dissonance demands resolution, but resolution requires humility, and humility requires acknowledging mistakes, and that is a journey not everyone is ready to take, so instead they remain restless, oscillating between pride and vulnerability, between wanting to reach out and wanting to protect their ego, between convincing themselves you will return and fearing that you never will, and this internal tug-of-war becomes their new normal. Because your absence removed the certainty they once leaned on, and certainty once lost is not easily rebuilt, especially when the one who walked away has found clarity, because clarity is quiet but powerful. It does not beg, it does not argue, it simply moves forward, and forward movement is something they can feel even if you never announce it, and that feeling keeps them awake longer than they admit, keeps them distracted during conversations, keeps them wondering whether they misjudged the depth of your strength, and perhaps the most transformative part of all of this is that you did not walk away to make them restless, you walked away to make yourself whole, and yet in choosing yourself you inadvertently triggered their introspection, because absence forces evaluation in a way presence rarely does, and while you are no longer responsible for their emotional process, your departure became the catalyst for it. And whether they grow from this restlessness or simply sit in it depends entirely on their willingness to confront their own patterns, but one thing remains undeniable. Your walking away shifted something fundamental. It disrupted complacency, it exposed imbalance, it replaced certainty with uncertainty, and in that shift lies the reason they are restless now, because sometimes losing someone is not about heartbreak alone, it is about confronting the version of yourself that failed to appreciate what you had, and that confrontation is never comfortable, it lingers, it echoes. It demands attention, and until it is faced, restlessness remains, whispering your name in the quiet spaces they can no longer escape, and as time moves forward and the initial shock of your absence settles into a deeper realization, their restlessness does not fade the way they expected it to, instead it evolves into something more complex and harder to ignore. Because at first they told themselves this was temporary, that you just needed space, that eventually you would soften and return the way you may have in the past, but days turn into weeks and your silence remains steady, not angry, not dramatic, just firm, and that firmness unsettles them more than any argument ever could, because arguments at least keep a connection alive. Even conflict feels like engagement, but indifference, or what appears to be indifference, feels like being erased, and the possibility that you are no longer emotionally invested the way you once were forces them to confront a fear they tried to suppress. The fear that they miscalculated your limits, that they assumed your loyalty had no expiration date, that they believed your patience was endless. And now they are discovering that even the most understanding heart has a boundary once it has been crossed too many times, and this discovery chips away at their confidence in subtle ways, because it is one thing to walk away from someone and feel in control, but it is another thing entirely to be the one left standing in the silence, unsure whether reaching out would restore connection or confirm rejection, so they hesitate, and in that hesitation their mind becomes louder, replaying moments they once dismissed, remembering the times you tried to communicate your needs calmly and clearly, remembering the slight disappointment in your eyes when your effort was not reciprocated, remembering how you stayed even when leaving would have been easier, and now those memories feel heavier because they are viewed through the lens of loss. And loss has a way of sharpening clarity, and clarity has a way of exposing regret, and regret feeds restlessness in a cycle that is difficult to break, because they cannot undo what has already happened, they cannot go back and respond differently, they cannot unlearn the complacency that cost them your presence, and so they sit with a growing awareness that you walking away was not impulsive but inevitable, that your strength did not appear overnight but was built slowly through every moment you swallowed your hurt and chose to try again, and realizing that makes them question how they failed to notice the shift happening right in front of them, how they overlooked the quiet withdrawal of your energy before your physical absence followed, how they mistook your calm for weakness instead of maturity, and this questioning begins to stretch beyond the relationship itself and into their own patterns, because if you were not the problem they once framed you as in moments of defensiveness, then what does that say about them? And that question is not easy to sit with, so sometimes they distract themselves with noise, with new conversations, with temporary attention from others, hoping it will soothe the discomfort, but comparisons happen naturally and unfairly, and they find themselves measuring every interaction against what they had with you, noticing how rare it was to feel truly understood without having to over-explain, noticing how safe it felt to be vulnerable without fear of judgment, noticing how you celebrated their wins genuinely and supported them in their lows without keeping score, and when they realize that not every connection offers that depth, the restlessness intensifies because now it is not just about missing you, it is about recognizing your value in hindsight, and hindsight can be merciless because it removes the illusions that once protected the ego, and the ego resists this new narrative fiercely, trying to rewrite history in ways that make the loss feel mutual or inevitable rather than self-inflicted, but deep down there is an acknowledgement that things could have been different if they had shown up more consistently, if they had communicated more honestly, if they had met your emotional investment with equal effort, and that acknowledgement hums beneath the surface of their daily routine, interrupting moments of distraction with flashes of memory, and sometimes they even draft messages in their mind, rehearsing what they might say if they were brave enough to reach out, wondering whether an apology would matter now, wondering whether you would respond warmly or politely distant, and the uncertainty of your reaction becomes its own source of anxiety, because your predictability is gone, and unpredictability creates vulnerability, and vulnerability is something they may have avoided while you were there offering reassurance freely, and now they must face it alone. And perhaps what unsettles them most is the realization that you are not displaying bitterness publicly, you are not trying to provoke jealousy. You are not broadcasting sadness, you are simply living, growing, moving quietly, and that quiet growth speaks volumes, because it suggests you have processed the pain enough to choose peace over revenge, and peace is powerful, it signals closure even without conversation, and closure without their participation can feel like being left behind in a chapter that has already ended for you but is still unresolved for them. And so they oscillate between wanting to reclaim what was lost and fearing that they no longer have access to the version of you who would have welcomed them back without hesitation, and that fear is rooted in the awareness that you have changed, that walking away required courage, that courage builds confidence, and confidence rebuilds identity, and the person who rebuilds themselves after disappointment rarely returns to the same dynamic without new standards, and new standards require growth on both sides. And growth requires effort, and effort is uncomfortable. When someone has grown used to ease, so they remain suspended in this restless state, aware enough to feel the loss but not always brave enough to confront it directly, and in that space they learn something profound even if they do not articulate it. They learn that love without effort eventually dissolves, that loyalty without appreciation eventually withdraws, that presence without reciprocity eventually fades. And these lessons linger long after the initial separation, shaping how they view not only you but themselves, because your absence has become a teacher, one that speaks without words, one that challenges without accusation, one that reveals truths through contrast, and whether they choose to grow from this restlessness or simply carry it into their next connection remains their responsibility. But what cannot be denied is that your decision to walk away created a shift that continues to echo in their inner world. Because sometimes the most powerful statement a person can make is not spoken at all. It is the quiet act of leaving when staying would have meant shrinking, and in choosing not to shrink you expanded into a version of yourself they are only now beginning to understand, and that understanding, delayed and bittersweet, is what keeps them restless long after you have found your calm. As more time passes and the distance between you becomes something measurable in months instead of days, the restlessness inside them no longer feels sharp and chaotic but deep and constant. Like a quiet hum they cannot switch off, because now it is no longer about reacting to your departure, it is about living with the consequences of it, and consequences have a way of settling into everyday life in subtle but undeniable ways, showing up in the spaces you used to fill so naturally, in the routines that once included you without effort, in the small reflex to share a thought or a joke before remembering that you are no longer there to receive it, and it is in those ordinary moments that the weight of your absence becomes undeniable, because extraordinary memories can be romanticized, but ordinary companionship is irreplaceable, and they begin to understand that what they lost was not just emotional intensity but emotional consistency, not just passion but partnership, not just attention but alignment, and this understanding does not arrive all at once, it unfolds gradually, sometimes painfully, as they observe how different their world feels without your steady presence anchoring it, and they may try to convince themselves that moving on quickly is strength, that replacing connection is healing, that distraction equals progress. But in the quiet hours when performance drops and honesty rises, they feel the gap between surface interactions and the depth you once offered, and that gap reminds them that what they had with you was not easily replicated, because depth requires vulnerability. And vulnerability requires trust, and trust requires effort. Sustained over time, and effort is something they may not have fully given when they had the chance, and this realization lingers like an unfinished sentence in their mind, because it forces them to confront a version of themselves that was comfortable receiving but hesitant to reciprocate fully, and growth often begins with discomfort. And discomfort is exactly what your absence has delivered. Not as punishment but as reflection, because when you walked away you removed the buffer that once softened the consequences of their inconsistency, and now there is nothing to cushion the truth, and the truth is that you did not leave because you stopped caring, you left because caring alone was no longer enough to sustain something one-sided, and that distinction reshapes how they replay the narrative in their head, because it shifts the focus from blaming circumstances to evaluating behavior, and behavior is harder to defend when patterns become visible. And perhaps the most unsettling part is recognizing that you gave signals before you left, that your energy shifted slowly, that your efforts became quieter, that your patience thinned in subtle ways, and they ignored those signals assuming you would always adapt, always forgive, always remain, and now they understand that permanence is not promised to those who take it for granted, and this awareness does not just affect how they view you, it affects how they view themselves. Because losing someone who truly saw them exposes insecurities they did not have to face before, insecurities about worth, about maturity, about readiness for real commitment, and instead of being able to deflect those insecurities onto your supposed flaws, they must sit with the possibility that they were not as prepared for depth as they believed, and that recognition is humbling, and humility is rarely comfortable. So sometimes they fluctuate between missing you and resenting the mirror your absence has become, because growth triggered by loss can feel unfair even when it is necessary, and yet despite any pride or stubbornness, there are moments when they almost reach out, moments when nostalgia softens their defenses and they imagine what it would feel like to hear your voice again, to clear the air, to attempt repair, but then doubt intervenes, because they sense that you are no longer standing in the same emotional place you once were. They sense that you have moved forward internally even if your life looks similar externally, and this sensing is not based on dramatic gestures from you but on your calm consistency in staying gone, in not reacting, in not circling back out of loneliness, and that steadiness communicates more than words ever could. It communicates finality, and finality creates fear, because fear asks a difficult question: what if this is truly over? What if the chance has passed? What if the version of you who would have fought endlessly for this connection no longer exists, and that question echoes in them during moments of vulnerability, reminding them that opportunities are time-sensitive, that people evolve, that patience has limits, and as they watch you continue to build your life without seeking their validation, they begin to grasp a deeper truth, that your departure was not about hurting them but about honoring yourself, and honoring oneself is transformative, because it shifts the dynamic from seeking love to embodying self-respect, and self-respect radiates in a way that is impossible to ignore, even from a distance, and so their restlessness gradually transforms into something more reflective, less reactive, more contemplative, because now it is not just about wanting you back, it is about understanding what it would take to deserve you again, and that understanding requires growth that cannot be faked, apologies that cannot be shallow, change that cannot be temporary. And whether they are ready for that level of introspection remains uncertain, but the seed has been planted, the awareness exists, the contrast between who they were with you and who they are without you is visible, and contrast is a powerful teacher, because it reveals value through absence, and while you continue to walk forward grounded in the decision you made, they remain in a space of evaluation, balancing memory with reality, pride with longing, regret with possibility. And in that balancing act the restlessness persists not as chaos but as a quiet reminder that losing someone who loved you deeply is not easily dismissed. It reshapes you, it humbles you, it forces you to reconsider what you once assumed would always be there, and perhaps the most profound shift of all is that your absence has shown them that love is not sustained by comfort alone but by conscious effort, and if they ever choose to approach you again it will not be from a place of control or assumption but from recognition. Recognition that you walking away was not the end of your strength but the beginning of it, and that strength is something they now see clearly, even if they saw it too late.